session and give you a little bit of information about the true story or the broader story around Apollo 11, the mission and the people involved. And we have a special guest here with us who was actually working at one of the tracking stations that was part of the mission and the national mission. So I'll just go through it if you like. So NASA had different communication networks. There was the manned spaceflight network, which was set up obviously to use and control and communicate with the manned program. The deep space network, which is involved in things that go further out away from the Earth and the Earth-Moon complex. And then the spacecraft tracking and data acquisition network, which was basically involved in satellites, unmanned satellites in Earth orbit. They talked a little bit about it during the film, but I just thought I'd just sort of give you a run through again on how the signals were received and transited back to Houston. This is an American graphic, and if you notice the top bottom right-hand corner, they've kind of moved the geographic locations of Sydney and Honeysuckle Creek. But anyway, let's brush over that. So as mentioned, the Goldstone facility in the US and then the Australian facilities both actually had vision of the television from the moon at the start of the moonwalk, although Goldstone lost it fairly soon after that with the rotation of the Earth. We go further along. Basically, once the signals were received moved to Sydney and then sent up to a satellite back to the US and then broadcast around to the rest of the world. The unique thing, however, in Australia was that we actually got our feed directly from Sydney. So our signal, the TV pictures we were watching, were like a few milliseconds earlier than everybody else. 6 seconds. 6 seconds.
They had a delay in
6 seconds. In case they sunk into it.
In case somebody died or something.
Now, to give you an idea of how complex this network was, and in some ways still is, although a lot of the technologies allowed some of this stuff not to happen, you can see the US, Australia, Europe, and the different locations of facilities and the different techniques to move signals around. You've got switching stations, you've got cable, you've got landline, you've got radio, you've got satellite. Just to give you an idea of some of the facilities around, we've got Parkes, which actually, I must say, Parkes is actually a radio telescope. They can't transmit out to anything, they receive. They essentially receive radio signals from space. But they used it for the Apollo 11 mission and other missions. Honeysuckle Creek. Honeysuckle Creek is a dedicated Apollo and manned spaceflight facility just outside of Canberra. It's not there any longer. It actually received the signals first, but we'll go over that a little bit later. Goldstone, they mentioned Goldstone, is in America, but they didn't actually make any mention of Madrid. If you think of remember the basketball he was talking about? Well, actually you need 3 stations in order for at least one station to always be visible from the moon. So they actually had 3 stations. Australia, Honeysuckle Creek, Goldstone in California, and in Spain. So all part of the network. Then there's Tidbinbilla, Island Lagoon, Aurora Valley. We'll talk about Aurora Valley in a moment. Carnarvon, Cuba Creek, Sydney. So there's the switching station in Canberra and then the OTC in Sydney, which actually sent the signals up through to the satellite. Then on top of all that, there were areas of the Earth where there was no coverage for either deep space or orbital stuff, so they put out ships in order to fill in those gaps. And then there were other areas where they were flying aircraft to be able to do communications during certain parts of the mission. So you can see that this is a massive network of communications, all having to be coordinated between each other. And of course, a lot of it was backup. So Parkes was brought in as an extra layer of security to make sure that they were able to get signals. Now the TV, in fact, if you actually talk to the guys involved in the mission itself, TV was a bit of an add-on extra. The main thing they were interested in is data, telecommunications relating to, telemetry relating to the spacecraft, the astronauts and the health of the vehicles, etc. So just to summarise, this is the network in Australia and how those signals were received, moved around and then sent off to headquarters in the US. This is Honeysuckle Creek. They received the very first pictures. They were a little bit higher. They mentioned the movie about parks not being able to see the moon. Honeysuckle Creek actually received the signals first, and this is a Honeysuckle Creek station, and this is one of the guys on the TV console. This is 60s technology, the cutting edge of 60s technology, receiving and processing the signal. Up the top you have the control station in the parks. In the middle there's the switching station before it gets sent off to the rest of the world. So parks actually, Honeysuckle Creek actually received the signals and transmitted the first steps by Armstrong onto the moon before parks got there. So there's a few things in the movie. The movie is a movie, right? They've brushed over a few things, they've dramatised a few things, and they've made it a few artistic license with some of the truth. So Honeysuckle Creek got the signals first in 10 minutes. The signal was through Honeysuckle Creek. When the moon rose sufficiently, the signal through parks, because it's a much bigger dish, was deemed to be better, so they switched over to that. Together, they allowed a fifth of the world's population, which at the time was, well, I think they said the viewing audience was 600 million people, so a fifth of the world population were able to see those pictures. The real guy, they used fictional characters in the film. The real station director was actually John Bolton, not Cliff Buxton. This is he there. He was an astronomer. There was no power failure. That was just a pure bit of fiction, just to make it a bit more exciting. In fact, the quality at parks has been reported, and throughout the network, and I've met several of the guys, that the testing, the double redundancy that they put in was actually incredible. This is a great example of it here, where they actually worked out how long it would take people to manually wind the dish to be able to move it if there was no power. There was absolutely no animosity between the Americans and the teams here. They worked very closely together. And Gordon actually visited Honeysuckle Creek in the parks.
Oh.
And I'm sorry, everybody, there is no cricket on the dish. Apparently, when they made the movie, they said you can stand in this spot and that spot only. Don't go either way, and they choreographed every step. However, they do take hay rides up to get up to the equipment up the top. In fact, NASA did get coordinates of some of the early missions wrong, and they did go out ahead of schedule. They had a couple of plans, and they thought, well, we'll either go early or wait, depending on what's happening. They decided to go with the early plan, and in fact, that meant that Australia was in the prime receiving situation. And they did operate in those very high winds, and they actually risked the equipment and the people there in order to keep it running. One of the nice things about it was that the props that they used were very authentic, and in fact some of the equipment was actually real equipment that was left there by the NASA people when they were there. So with that, I'm going to introduce you now to someone who's actually working in the NASA network, the communication network, and his name is Mike Tobin, and he was working at a facility called Aurora Valley in New South Wales, not too far from Canberra. I haven't been there. So. Mike Tobin.
Okay. My name's Mike Tobin. I worked in a tracking station in Canberra called Aurora Valley. I was there from just before the moon mission, the Apollo 11, right back through till 1971. And just to take you back to the early 60s when we first decided we were going to go to the moon, just some things we didn't have in Australia. We didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have home video recorders, CD players and video players, personal computers. Television was in two-colour black and white, and currency was still in pounds, sterling and pence. But the world was looking at the moon, and the Americans and the Soviet Union were trying to beat one another to do the most spectacular things they could in space. Tullamarine Airport was still being built here in Victoria, and the Opera House was being built in Sydney. I was very fortunate to work on both of those projects, but I can tell you the glory of working on the Opera House wasn't all that it seemed to be. Many days of working in very concrete, dusty sort of environment, trying to put the audio system together for the Opera House. I was glad to get home each day and glad when the job was actually finished and I went back to AWA at North Ryde. AWA had just tendered for to supply staff to NASA to man the Aurora Valley Station and been successful. So there was a change of staff there. Some of the staff from EMI stayed on, and there was some new staff came in from AWA, and I was fortunate enough to be one of those staff. But by the time I got there, we'd already sent Apollo 8, that's Apollo 8 on its big transporter that Darren was talking about earlier on, and it's on its way out to the launch pad. And Apollo 10 had also been to the moon, although it had only orbited the moon and come back again. They hadn't actually manned it. Apollo 11, and that's actually Buzz coming down the hatched photo taken on the surface by Armstrong. The dish at Aurora was a bit different to the one that they showed at Parkes. It was the same construction as the one that was at Honeysuckle Creek. You'll see that it's got two very large half-round gearing mechanisms. With the dish that they had at Parkes, for it to go right over from one side to the other, it would have to go up to the top, turn around and go back down again, which meant that it was alright for when they were looking at something on the moon that was there for a long period of time, but for spacecraft that we were tracking, and in fact for manned spaceflight that was in Earth orbit, it was sometimes necessary to go right over the top very quickly, and they could do it with that type of antenna. So there was a difference in the Parkes antenna to the actual Aurora antenna. That was the Honeysuckle Creek antenna, very similar construction to Aurora Valley's. The Aurora Valley antenna has ended up in Tasmania. When the station was closed, the University of Tasmania made a bid to acquire the antenna, and NASA said you can have it if you can take it away. They got in touch with Lindsay Fox and through his transport company, and managed to transport it down to Tasmania, and it's still in service today for the University of Tasmania. The work that Aurora Valley did was basically making sure that space was safe for the astronauts to travel to the moon, and there was a number of spacecraft that they tracked, looking at the atmosphere or the space between the Earth and the moon, the radiation levels that were there, sunspot activity, a whole host of things that would be dangerous for spacemen to go between the Earth and the moon, and they needed to know that was safe before they actually went on the missions. That was a lot of the tracking that I did in Aurora Valley. That's just the Aurora Valley tracking network, the stations that are part of that complex that Peter was showing there before. They are all tracking stations in the Aurora Valley network. I was going to go and talk a little bit more about some of the things that the astronauts had to contend with, but we decided that we just briefly skip through this. One of the things that the people that said it wasn't possible to go to the moon said was that, in fact, the radiation belts around the Earth would make it impossible for people to go. And they pictured them as being a disc around the whole of the Earth, and in fact, no matter which way you went out through them, you would always go through the radiation, and the radiation levels were so high that they would kill the astronauts. But in fact, they aren't. They're a donut. And you can see there that, in fact, if you launch out through the whole of the donut, you virtually don't have to go through the radiation belts at all. And that was how they safely managed to get the men on the way to the moon. These are some of the spacecraft that they used to make sure that space was safe. Quickly through here. That's another diagram of how they managed to escape. You see, if you look at that yellow part there when they were in orbit around the Earth, they were then able to sneak out through the hole. And in fact, the radiation that they experienced was less than people that work in the X-ray industries get on an annual basis. This is the Aurora Valley dish control panel, and the tape recorders recorded all the data that came back from all the spacecraft. They were terrible things, those tape recorders. Whenever we had to record data from a spacecraft, you would stand there with your finger on two go buttons at the same time, because inevitably one of those reels would start and the other one wouldn't, and the 2-inch tape that was on them would stretch out to about 1/4-inch tape and then eventually break, and so you'd lose it. So you'd stand there with a finger on either machine and go bang and try and make sure that you at least got one of them going all the time. One of the main things that Aurora Valley tracked in conjunction with the manned spaceflight network were the packages that the astronauts left behind on the moon. And part of the job that they had there was to, in fact, leave these experiments behind, and they continued to track them. They actually had a little, the thing they called a thermal generator was in fact a little atomic power station that powered up all the experiments, and they continued to transmit back to Earth, and Aurora Valley tracked quite a lot of them. In fact, when they finally decided to turn those packages off, Aurora Valley was the station that actually sent the command to turn all the offset packages off. There's a picture of someone. They look like something from the local tip, don't they?
Washing machine.
One of the things that we would have occasion to do at Aurora Valley would be, if we're in the middle of a pass, the dish would fill up with snow because it's in the back blocks of the Australian Alps. And if it did, we would have to swing over onto one of the standby antennas, which, because of their different construction, wouldn't fill up with snow. And then we would bring the dish round and we would actually tap it against its stops and cause an avalanche of snow to come pouring out of the dish, and then switch back to the dish again and keep on tracking. You'd be in trouble with the maintenance department if you did it a bit too hard. They had compressible aluminium packaging on the end of the track, and if you damaged one of those, you'd know all about it. One of the funniest things that ever happened to me on the station down there was, this is the road that runs from Tharwa down south to past the Honeysuckle Creek, turn off and down to Aurora Valley. And you'll notice if you look carefully there that it's built up above the countryside. That barbed wire fence is quite a way below it. I went round this corner one morning, and not far beyond it the road swings round to the right, and as I went round there was one of the company cars sitting in the middle of the paddock on top of a rock with all 4 wheels off the ground. He somehow managed to skid in the corner, cleared the barbed wire fence, and hadn't stopped until he put the car smack bang on top of this rock. So there were 5 in his car and 5 in my car. So we put 3 in the boot and 7 of us in the car, and we went on and continued on the way to work. And sent the maintenance crew out to get the car. There's the dish as we would bring it down in the stow position to shake the snow out of it. And there's one other very interesting incident that happened. We were tracking one day, and suddenly we lost the signal off the dish. And we very quickly came to the conclusion that somewhere in the cables between the dish and the receiver equipment, we'd got a broken cable or a broken connector. So we quickly grabbed one of those other antennas, put it onto the receiver and continued on tracking the spacecraft. And then we went looking for this fault. And the floor was a raised floor with all the cables running underneath it. So we lifted the panels up and started tracking this cable through. And I put my hand down under the cable and yelled out to the guy at the other end, "That's the one! I felt you pull it." He said, "I didn't pull the cable." And looked down to see what I'd actually grabbed hold of, and it was about a 4-foot long tiger snake that was So the guy that was helping me with it was rather keen on the idea of taking the snake into Canberra and taking it to CSIRO so they could milk it for the venom, for anti-venom. And he happened to be in my car, so there was 4 of us sitting across the front seat of the Falcon with the bench seat, and he had the back seat all to himself with the tiger snake inside his wheelbase. So, you know, life in the tracking stations was serious most of the time, but it did have its highlights too. So I enjoyed it. The work that we did at Aurora was considered to be essential to the Apollo missions. They needed to know particularly what that space was like between the Earth and the Moon, and also they needed to be able to get the results back from those packages they had behind. So I was very pleased to be able to do it. I had the fortune of meeting Neil, shaking his hand, and yeah, something part of my life and the work that I did all through my life that I'll never ever forget. Thank you.
Okay, we're just about at the end of the session now.
Oh, I want to show you that. Can you go?
Sorry, yeah. This one?
No, the one before it. Okay, that's Honeysuckle Creek and Parks. Honeysuckle Creek on the left and Parks on the right. If you have a look, you'll see Parks is upside down. And they had to actually get Honeysuckle to set it upside down so that it would be the right way around when it went to the rest of the world. Because the actual equipment, you can see quite clearly, there's the ground on the bottom of the one here from Honeysuckle, and then this one up here, the ground is at the top and the ladder is, in fact, if you look very close, you can see the ladder's going up at the bottom of the picture.
That's because it's down under, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike. Fantastic. Well, we've actually got to make tracks here. I just wanted to, you might have noticed this background I've been showing through this presentation. I'll do that again. You can follow that little circle. That's actually a picture from a lunar reconnaissance orbiter of the Moon, of the landing spot of Apollo 11, and you can see the descent stage of the Apollo 11 lunar module sitting there to this day. So anyone that doesn't believe we went there, just have a look at that picture. I'll leave you with this quote from Neil Armstrong. And that's it. Thank you, everybody. I just want to say thank you to the members of the Space Association Committee. There's been a lot of work by a lot of members of the group that have put hours into this, and really glad to have you all along and support the group. Particularly our special guests to come along and spend their time with us today. And we're thinking next year, there's this movie about Apollo 13. I don't know if anyone's heard of it. Just got to get an expression of interest if we did something like this again next year. Would anyone be interested in coming along?
Yes.
Yes. Well, we'll keep you informed of that. I just want one last thing before we go. If I get Mike and Darren up here, we'll just have a couple of little gifts to say thank you for their time and coming. The gifts we've got, this book is called Fallen Astronauts.